pass it along now. Oh, that's a good point to make here. We're gonna be recording all of the webinars in this series so that we can put them on the USET YouTube page. And then I'll also share that in a follow-up email to everybody that's registered for the event, so that if there's someone on your staff that you'd like to check out this webinar, they can do so after this webinar is completed. We'll have it on the YouTube page, and I'll share that in a follow-up email. So I'd like to also give the opportunity to any Tribal Nation departmental staff that are joining for the first time a webinar in this series. So if any departmental staff from Tribal Nations are on the call, now is your time to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ben Simpson. I'm the Wildlife Resource Manager for the Penobscot Nation in Maine.
Thanks, Ben. Is there anyone else from tribal departmental staff that would like to introduce themselves? Okay, thank you. And in the interest of time, I know we have some new faces, some new names in the participant panel here. So if you are new to the USET Forest and Wetlands webinar series, please feel free to type up your introduction and put it in the chat here in the Zoom window, and everyone can get to know each other by reading through the chat. All right. So this is the loyalty card checklist document. I've been sending this out in a couple of emails to try to get everybody up to date with what's going to be offered for writing reflections and tasks at each webinar, so that you can potentially earn one of the 3 incentive packages that we've put together for participants of this webinar series. At each webinar, you'll all get the opportunity to share a reflection in general. So if you have a reflection from a previous webinar, I offer the opportunity at the beginning for people to share a reflection. And then at the end, I also offer the opportunity for people to share a reflection. That prompt is one thing I learned from today's webinar was. And so at this point, I'd like to offer, if anyone wanted to share a reflection from the first 2 webinars in this webinar series, please feel free to unmute yourself and share that now. So I did get some emailed reflections from the last couple webinars, which were really great. Some folks really learned a lot in the last webinar on emerald ash borer and management here in the Dawnland. A lot of people were unaware of the parasitoid wasps that were being released to combat emerald ash borer, and we discussed that in detail on the webinar. And then we also learned about some injected insecticide treatments of ash trees to protect them against emerald ash borer. And so some people shared some great reflections over email. And that's a good point here to highlight. If you have reflections that you've completed on this checklist, you can send those to me via email directly, and I can check them off. I've got a copy of this sheet in a binder with everybody that's registered for the event, so I can check it off as we go to see if you can have earned an incentive package, and we'll send that to you via the mail. Here in this particular webinar, there are 2 writing reflections I'd like to highlight that you can focus on as we hear from everyone today. So throughout the webinar, the reflection that I'm hoping everyone can get from each webinar is one thing I learned from today's webinar was. So keep that in mind. And then the other is in the film site visit, which I'll share here shortly, vernal pool conservation in working forests. Ram Calhoun discussed how vernal pools can serve as hotspots of biodiversity. Do you have habitats or features in the landscapes you work that serve similar roles? I'll zoom in on that so you can see that a little bit better. And then I just want to do a quick view of today's agenda. currently finishing up the introduction, and I'm going to cut to sharing a video site visit here in a minute. Vernal pool conservation and working forests, where we'll bring everyone here on the call to a vernal pool wetland in the traditional territories of the Wabanaki, or the people of the Don, and we'll explore vernal pool conservation and working forests. The video features Dr. Aram Calhoun, a professor emerita of wetland ecology and conservation at the University of Maine, Ben Simpson, the wildlife resource manager from the Penobscot Nation, who we got an introduction to or from just shortly ago. And then Dr. Malcolm or Mac Hunter is a professor emeritus of wildlife ecology at the University of Maine. And then to follow up that video, we will hear from Dr. Evan Grant about vernal pool research from across the Northeast, being led through the USGS Northeast Amphibian Research Monitoring Initiative. This work has connections to some research out of the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center on identifying climate resilient vernal pools. And Dr. Jennifer Cartwright will speak to this work following Evan's presentation. I think I saw Dr. Tony Lynn Morelli as well, and she may have some things to share in that presentation as well. And then to wrap up the content for today's webinar, we will have all the presenters that are featured in the video, as well as presenting today, featured on a panel. And I've got some questions for them, and I'll open it up to questions from the group. So without further ado, I want to jump right into sharing our film site visit. So I'm going to stop my share here for a second.
And just to let everyone know who's joining, and we found with videos, if you close your other applications on your computer and cameras and mute yourself, it helps with the bandwidth as well on your end, on the receiving end. So thank you very much, and then we'll open everyone back up again after the video concludes.
Yeah, and I see everyone's turned their mute on and shut their cameras off. I'm going to do the same, but I'll be monitoring the chat. If there's any issues of the video coming through on your end, just throw it in the chat and we'll see if we can resolve it. Share my screen here.
Hi, I'm Aram Calhoun. I'm a retired professor from the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries and Conservation Biology at the University of Maine. And I spent my career working on wetland ecology and conservation. I ended up working with forested wetlands because I'm sort of a person who likes to work with the underdog, and it wasn't until the late 70s that they were even regulated. And of course, it's not a glamorous species. Wood frogs and salamanders I discovered through my work. A lot of people think they're disgusting and slimy and don't want to hold them. So I am inspired working for underappreciated ecosystems. Being a small, unnoticed person, I can understand the wood frog and how it's feeling. And so basically, I do have a passion for working with amphibians, and I got that from the early age. I was always out in the wetlands in my neighborhood. Boys were smashing bullfrogs on the road, and I beat them up, and then we became a frog team, and I got those guys to work with me to patrol the neighborhood, looking for people smashing frogs, and of course it was only them, but they never noticed that we never found anybody. But we had a lot of fun in the wetlands, so it's been a long-term interest of mine. I've always felt at home in wetlands.
My name is Ben Simpson, and I am the Wildlife Resource Manager for the Penobscot Nation. So I am not a tribal member, but I feel working in this position I have learned from tribal members that we have a lot of the same sensibilities as far as the natural world, and I feel like I fit in with their ideas of how the world works and importance of wildlife and protection of the environment, and I feel it's been incredibly fulfilling in my career to work for the Penobscot Nation so far. My focus is primarily on big game species. That's what I was hired for. But considering my position in our department is 100% grant driven, we have to try and find funding from all avenues we can. And the Environmental Protection Agency, they offer wetland grants for tribes that I have applied for a few times.
My name is Mac Hunter. I'm a retired professor from the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology at the University of Maine. My work there focused on the interface between wildlife and forest management, how to maintain forest biodiversity in the context of managing forests for timber products was my focus for many decades. I also spend a lot of time on the forest here that I share with Aram, where I'm the chief pathfinder or path maker and maintainer, so that she doesn't get lost walking around in the woods back here.
We're here in our woods about to take a tour of a vernal pool. A lot of my work has been on vernal pool ecology, but more importantly, understanding the science behind management guidelines. So most of our students have worked on getting the biophysical data and working on what habitats amphibians go to after they breed, so that we can work out broader management plans for forestry and for development. I work on vernal pools mostly because they're a really great integrator of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and management. So although I think I'm known more as a vernal pool expert, I'm much more interested in conservation of whole systems and ecosystems and linkages among wetlands through terrestrial habitats. So that's what I'm hoping to talk about with you today, is a bit more about how vernal pools are really just nodes in the landscape and linkers of things.
The tribe relies on forestry in order to generate income, and they already have practices in place to protect sensitive areas that they follow federal guidelines, which are more strict than state guidelines. And so the one thing that we don't have guidelines for that are set are vernal pools. I know that foresters and the loggers will protect sensitive areas like vernal pools, but having a mapped areas of where those vernal pools are would be a great benefit to them. And so the tribe would like to map those areas in order to protect them as much as we possibly can. And so for the last 2 EPA grants, I wrote a proposal to try and get money or funding for the tribe to map vernal pools on tribal land in order to add that to the list of areas to protect.
So I had some experience working with Ben Simpson. He reached out and wondered if there was something that we could do to improve wetlands and bring it into line what the state was doing at various levels. So I worked with Ben. We were hoping to get funding to be able to develop that wetland program. Kristen Pete had come up with a classification system that incorporated native knowledge and had important plant locations and things that were relevant to the tribes, and we were hoping to actually include that in the classification system. So we're really hoping at some point to get a project launched that would allow us to further develop that wetlands program, and specifically to include vernal pools.
So today we're visiting a vernal pool that would not be unlike vernal pools found on tribal land. A lot of tribal land has not been touched for 40 years, and so there's a lot of mature forests and areas where we most likely have vernal pools that we have not located yet. So this will give us an idea of the habitat around the vernal pools and what sort of protections we can put in place for any forestry practices that we use as a tribe.
Balancing the idea of a forest as being a place for economic production and a home for a whole lot of species that we care about is a serious challenge. There is a lot that we can do in the context of what's sometimes now called ecological forestry, where we design forest practices, harvesting regimes with a view towards how closely they emulate the natural disturbances that occur, and to the extent that we can make our forest practices somewhat similar. There will always be profound differences to the natural disturbances, then we're practicing ecological forestry. And I hope that significant portions of our landscape will be managed with that in mind. I also think there's probably places on the landscape where we shouldn't practice forestry, where we let the forests grow old, and places where we take a more intensive production approach to forestry. All three of these uses, ecological forestry, places that we set aside, places where we manage the timber very intensively, are valid. They constitute what a colleague, Bob Seymour, and I call a triad approach to forest management. We'll be walking out this path a little less than a quarter mile to where we have a vernal pool that we discovered many years ago and have been watching carefully ever since. Quite a few research projects have actually undergone on that pool, so it's just a short walk out to a very special place.
We've arrived at our vernal pool, and it's only July 7th, and I was surprised to see that the pool is just about completely dry. But before we get into why that happened, let's all be clear on what we're defining a vernal pool as. It's a subset of wetlands, and it's a wetland that is pooled for a portion of the growing season. And some of them are even semi-permanent, meaning that they just dry down and always have a little bit of water in them. And some of them only dry every other year. But the key is that they dry down, and so most of them are free breeding fish populations and free of green frog and bullfrog tadpoles, because those species take a couple seasons to develop. And that's important because there's a subset of animals in Maine that prefer to breed in vernal pools because they have no defenses against fish or the tadpoles of green frogs and bullfrogs. And those species are the wood frog and the blue and the spotted salamander and the charismatic crustacean that can be up to an inch in length called the fairy shrimp. So each of these pool breeding animals takes a different amount of time to be hatched or emerge from the pool. So those are the species that we have here. There's a snapping turtle moving into the pool right over there. That snapping turtle would have come from one of our permanent wetlands. It would have come from beaver flowage. And I was talking earlier to Ben about the fact that these pools are primarily defined as breeding habitat for these few species that I've mentioned, but they're really hubs for reptiles, birds, mammals, and other amphibians, because this ecosystem is incredibly productive. It's the one wet spot in the forest, and there's a lot of nutrients from the leaf litter. Releases all these nutrients, and we turn leaves and leaf litter in the form of frog bodies into carbon that exits the pool and feeds lots of other animals. This is a prime example. We have a snapping turtle making its way to our pool. So we call vernal pools really fast food oases that have eat in and take out. And I'll give you an example. I know I'm pulling all this together, but I told you the definition is kind of dry and boring. It's a breeding habitat for those four species that dries down at some time during the year and doesn't have fish. But really, vernal pools are much bigger than that. They're completely integrated into the terrestrial habitat. And we have an example of that happening right here with this snapping turtle, which is going to eat here, and then it's going to bring that carbon back to our permanent ponds. So there's these direct linkages. So this pool, I was a little surprised that we got here and it's just two little puzzles. It's early July. This is a semi-permanent pool. It's one of those pools that doesn't completely dry down, and there's always like an open pool of water in the back there, which is not there now. And this is why your work is so important with the tribe in maintaining connections among wetlands. We are experiencing more drought. If this pool is dry, we probably have a lot of losses in the surrounding landscape, because this is one of the wettest pools. What we look for in having a resilient landscape is, there's a snapping turtle coming towards you, having pools of various hydro periods, so that if some dry prematurely, there are other pools with longer hydro periods on the landscape. This guy is amazing. We're not bothering him. Okay, the turtle disappeared, and it's under the muck. You can't even see it. And this is another example of the function of vernal pools for places to estivate. We all know about hibernating in the winter to get away from the cold, but these serve as refugia for animals that need to get out of the baking heat. And estivating it's the summer equivalent of hibernating. It's a place to be cool. This turtle has gone down for a little estivation nap. And who would know this? Because when do we survey vernal pools? In the early spring. No one watches them throughout the year. And so not many people know all the functions that these pools have. And if we were to sit out here all summer, I'm sure we'd come up with some more.
Right.
But the Penobscot tribe that you work with, I love that the forestry and the wetland department talk to each other. We don't even do that much at the university. So the fact that they each care and learn about is a really good sign for these animals, because one of the key things about the habitat management practices that we'll talk about was trying to maintain land around the pools that can lead toward connection to other wetland types. Well, right around the bend is a beaver flowage. So part of our resilience plan and the management that we're telling people who care about vernal pool species, well, think about what secondary habitats might be. Beaver flowages, as you know, because I've been in Alton on the lands, they're very convoluted, and there's always pockets where they can get away from the fish, and we see vernal pool species breeding in the beaver flowages, and they tend to hold more water longer thanks to the beaver. So we need to start thinking about connecting all these vernal pool dots with these other aquatic resources, and it sounds like that's what you're sensitive to anyway. Your job is working with larger game and not working with wetlands. Do you have any questions about anything that I've said about vernal pools right now that might be relevant to you?
I have a question about some of the characteristics that come into play on when vernal pools, what time of year they dry out.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the vernal pools intersect the groundwater table.
Okay.
And this is one of those. And if I were to walk out where that turtle is estivating, I would have sunk through to here.
So it has a source from below ground.
Correct. Then there's pools that you'll see on the height of land, and they only pull water because there's like an impermeable layer in the pool, but they're completely dependent on runoff from the little bit of land and rainfall. And we call those flashy pools, and they hold water a lot less long. So as a manager, I would urge you to keep pools of all hydro periods and diversity in your basket.
Does the fragility of the vernal pool change throughout the season?
Yeah, well, I noticed when we were talking earlier, Ben, that you said that the tribe only harvests dry periods and winter, right? So the pool is obviously less sensitive to disturbance in the winter and when it's completely dry. But right now we're standing in a pool that's still has those refuge pools of water. And if we were to go tromping through there, I like to keep school kids and stuff out during this time because there's a lot of young amphibians developing. When it's dry and in winter, you can actually go right through the pool. And one other thing that reminds me is when you look at this pool, how would you know this is a vernal pool? It doesn't look like a pond anymore.
Right.
When it's dry, you as a manager can walk through it And if you get down on your hands and knees and you rifle through the leaf litter or the sphagnum or whatever's here, caddisfly cases, you'll find fingernail clams, you'll see evidence that it's aquatic. And then what you do as a manager is you put that on your map and say, this is a potential vernal pool, we got to come back in the spring. Because I'm finding remains of aquatic insects in here. That's the other point that we should make for land managers, is that vernal pools don't all look the same at all. The only thing that the definition is not a kind of wetland, it's only what breeds in it. So it's important to know that the definition is not based on the kind of wetland it is. It's based on its hydro period, how long it holds water, and the breeding amphibians and fairy shrimp that are in it.
I was curious on sort of the exact management practices or protections that you guys recommend.
Okay. So I worked on the habitat management guidelines with Philip Domain-Nadier, and we had a stakeholder group, and we all developed this together. And I'm only telling you that so that you know that it isn't a bunch of ecologists doing this. We had loggers involved, forest managers involved in the development of these. And then at the same time, but before we finished our research, the University of Maine undertook looking at what we call post-breeding habitat. That's after these animals all leave and move into the forest. They spend 95+% of their life history in the forest, all of these amphibians, right? So that was the interest, was moving out of the pool into the forest and talking about what would be the best management strategies based on what we know about their movement and habitat selection.
Right.
And that's what you want to know.
Exactly.
So with the habitat management guidelines, we identified 3 zones. The vernal pool itself, and you and I already talked about its sensitivity. Stay out of it during the growing season. Like it's a no-go zone in the vernal pool. Just leave it be, except in the winter, right? That's okay. But there's no heavy equipment, no persons, nothing in the pool. And then there's a 100-foot zone around the pool, which is a sensitive zone because some research in New England has shown that these animals leaving the pool as young may indeed spend the first winter in that first 100 feet because they're just little things that can dry up easily and be eaten. So a lot of them take refuge in perhaps this first 100 feet. So that 100 feet is also the zone where the trees provide the canopy cover for the pool and the water quality of the pool. They provide the leaf litter, and look at all the down material here. If a tree branch falls in there or something, a lot of the animals will lay their egg masses on that fallen woody material. So this is a really important part of the food web of the pool. That's the reason for having an intact forest around the pool. So that first 100 feet, it's not that we don't have any forest practices in there, it's that they're gentle ones. So we're asking for leaving 75% canopy cover and removing trees but without heavy equipment. So you'd have to like pull them out individually. And then that zone beyond that, we'll walk into that zone and talk about what the management is there. Philip and I and the people in the forestry community came up with the guidelines, and we did our best, but it turns out that the research has supported what we came up with for being a good strategy. So you can adopt this feeling pretty good that it's real science that's been tested.
Can't beat that.
Yeah, you can't beat that. But so right here we have the zone with the pool, which is a no-go zone, and then we have the first 100 feet, which maintains the water quality and is sort of a nursery for the amphibians. Then we'll go beyond that and talk about where you can do real forest management. So Ben, just to repeat, we have the 3 zones. We did the vernal pool, and then we're sitting right outside the 100-foot zone, and you look down that way and you can imagine the 100 to 400-foot zone. And that's the zone where we recommend 50% canopy removal with no greater than an acre opening. Just remember that they're guidelines and that your goal, it might not be 400 feet, it might be more, it might be less, but the goal is to know where your other wetlands are and make sure that the forest has enough canopy and coarse woody debris on the ground that an amphibian could travel through it to get to another wetland.
Yeah, and I imagine leaving as much canopy cover as you can is most important.
Well, you know what, that's a good metric. Leave as much as you can.
Right. And
we know we have a beaver flowage over here, so I would really try to maintain that 50% and maybe higher if you could. But if you're managing for the vernal pool and you have a granite mountain block over here, you know they're not going over there.
Right.
So maybe you could do a little heavier cut there. But the difference, I don't worry so much about the forest managers because forest comes back even in a clear cut. But when we, in developing areas, they don't come back. And that's just like gone habitat forever. These amphibians, they go back to the pool that they hatched in 95% of the time. In a forest, the worst thing that you want to make sure you don't have in your 400-foot zone are skidder ruts. Because they pool water. The amphibians are headed to their natal pool. They come across a skidder rut. There's water in the rut. They lay their eggs. They just think they got there sooner. And we call those ecological traps because they won't be successfully hatched from there. You just don't want to compact the soil or rip up the soil, leave big ruts. And if you do have to do a big clear cut, some intensive management is good if you have to impact less of the landscape. Just try to avoid vernal pool complexes.
So if we're going to be doing forestry practices within the zone of the vernal pool, are there equipment limitations that are suggested?
So you would have to tell me what you would use. The key is just minimizing disturbance to the forest floor, and it sounds like you've already, you know, by doing it on dry land and in the winter, you've reduced that. But I'm not an expert on the equipment they use anymore, but you get the spirit of the thing.
I know that at least the tribe's goal and what I've seen in logging practices is trying to limit their footprint as much as possible. And so
the only thing they say about equipment is no motorized equipment in the 100-foot zone, but they don't say anything about the type of equipment that you should use in the 400-foot zone.
when you're thinking of vernal pools, how do they fit into the ecosystem as a whole?
They have a much larger ecological impact than you would ever guess from the size of their footprint. Some people call this a keystone feature. They're making an analogy to the architectural term. You know, there's this arch of stones. The one stone in the center is the one that is holding it all together, and they call that a keystone. So people talk about keystone features, and as part of landscapes, ecologically way more important than you would ever predict. Vernal pools are just a perfect classic example of this concept, way more important than you would ever guess.
I sort of agreed to come take part in this today kind of as a favor to Aram for all the help she's helped me with my grant proposals. And a few minutes in, I realized I was learning so much about vernal pools that I had never known before. I kind of forgot that we were filming for a while, and I was able to listen to what Aram was saying and think about how those aspects of the vernal pool and those ecosystems I can take back to tribal land and use in my position. And I also realized that we're already doing quite a bit to protect those sort of areas on Penobscot Nation land. We're already protecting wet areas like vernal pools and wetlands and things like that. And so I think we're ahead of the curve a little bit in regards to protection, but I think that's how it goes for the tribe as a whole.
All right, that was great. I forgot to mention at the beginning, but Nolan Altivator is a citizen of Passamaquoddy at Pleasant Point. Sebaik is the videographer behind the camera there, and he really did capture that site visit really well. It felt like we were there at times, and I hope everyone else felt the same and got a lot out of that, because it was definitely a good video on my view. So I want to, in the interest of time, just limit it to one follow-up question to anybody that was featured in the video. We've got Ben on the call and Dr. Aram Calhoun on the call. If you guys want to ask them a question real quick here, we can take that question and then we'll bump along to the next thing on the agenda. Let me check the chat, make sure. Not seeing any. One thing I will say, the habitat management guidelines that were talked about in the video, it's an excellent PDF document outlining those really well, available online. So I'll share that as a resource to everyone to kind of check out, kind of give further context to what's being talked about in the video. It's a great resource. And so I'll share that in a follow-up email with the rest of the information. And you'll also have an opportunity to give another question to Ben or when they sit on the panel at the end of today's webinar. So I'm going to pass it along now to Dr. Evan Grant. Awesome, perfect. We're seeing the PowerPoint window right now, Evan. And now we're seeing the presentation. Perfect.
Okay, I lost the place where I turned my video on, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna get started. I'll turn it on at the end for questions once I close this out. I think that'll work best. Okay, so I just want to start by thanking you for the invitation, the opportunity to present the work that we're doing. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey, Eastern Ecological Science Center. We're formerly Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and I'm at the Esso Conte Naturalist Fish Research Lab in central Western Massachusetts. This is work I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleagues, Adrian Brand and Jill Fleming, who coordinate a lot of the research, the vernal pool work that we do across the northeastern United States. Okay, so what I want to do today is give a background on kind of the state of amphibians globally, nationally in the U.S., and then focus real closely on the vernal pool amphibian trends in the northeastern, so a regional view of how amphibian populations are doing. And then I want to talk a little bit about how the work we're doing is helping to inform management. In particular, we use this approach called structured decision making, and I'll give a brief overview of that. But ultimately, as a staff in the U.S. Geological Survey, all of my research is designed to inform conservation and management, and that's primarily with our federal partners in the Department of Interior. Okay, so by now everyone's heard, I hope, that amphibian species are declining, and in some cases they're threatened or extinct across the world. And in many cases, the causes are unknown. So this is a paper that was published in 2004, and this on the bottom left here is the kind of color coding of populations and populations that are in decline or expected to be in decline at that time. And particular interest is in this enigmatic decline kind of box here. Major issues besides these unexplainable enigmatic declines are exploitation or reduced habitat. And disease emerged right around this time as a principal driver, expected driver of amphibian declines. So in 2001, the program that I work with, the Amphibian Research and Monitoring Initiative, which is within the Department of Interior of the U.S. Geological Survey, we had collected a whole bunch of information on populations. So the bottom here, or the bottom of this plot on the left, is the number of populations. In blue is the frogs, and in red is the salamanders across the United States. And so this is, a range from around 30 to around 80 populations or locations where populations were surveyed. So in 2013, we took all those data together, and we estimated that across the United States, there was a decline in all species for which we had data of both frogs and salamanders. We also found that common species, which were largely considered to be stable, were declining at an average rate of 3 to 4% per year. That's a loss in the numbers of populations, not the abundance. We're losing 3 to 4% a year. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, 3 or 4%. It's a pretty low rate of decline. But if you multiply that out and translate that, it means that within 20 years, half of the places, the habitats where amphibians occur, are expected to be locally extinct. And we've done a bunch more monitoring since then, and we see, the declines in large part, have continued from 2013 until the present. Okay, so we found that climate is, in a follow-up study, we found that climate is driving declines in some places, but the drivers are different depending on where we were. So we divided up, each of the colors here represents a different location. And I'm just going to point your attention to the red circles. This is for the northeastern United States, from Virginia, West Virginia, all the way up until Maine. And on the left here, we have the effect size, or the relative importance of each of these drivers. And on the bottom, we have those drivers. So winter severity, maximum temperature in the summer, the average soil moisture, the percent of precipitation that falls as snow, and then water availability during the breeding season. And so what we find overall is that for northeastern forests, summers with above average soil moisture and water availability tended to be better. This totally makes sense, right? A lot of amphibians are reliant on water and habitat features that have water. We found, interestingly, that winter variables were less important to dynamics, or population dynamics of amphibians. And then this maximum summer temperature was also less important. So this we have support for kind of our intuition of what's driving amphibian populations. Here we looked at the sensitivity to different climate drivers of populations, and we found on the top left here, warmer winters were bad, so colder winters were generally better for persistence of populations. You see all the circles there in the northeast; those are all the locations where we had monitoring data. On the bottom left here, we found generally positive effects of increased summer temperature. So kind of warmer summer, on average, warmer summers tended to be better for amphibian persistence. And then on the bottom right here, more water at the time of breeding was generally better, but there's a lot of variability at the site level, individual site level. And this speaks to some of what Aram was pointing out about the different kinds of temporary habitats and different kinds of wetlands that are present on the landscape, and really thinking about the heterogeneity of habitats and their importance in annually dynamic years, or years where there's annual dynamics and kind of those environmental drivers. Okay, so now I'm going to bring it down to the northeastern United States. These are all of the parks and national wildlife refuges that I've partnered with since 2004, 2005. And this constitutes a regional vernal pool research. So this provides the basis for a lot of what I'm going to talk about here, and also the data that Jen's going to present in her talk later. We started in 2004. Many of the places that we work with didn't have sufficient maps of vernal pools. They're small features, they're hard to find unless you're out there wandering around. So the first thing we did is begin with mapping vernal pools. We found there's over 780 vernal pools that now are part of the monitoring program, and we estimated the density of vernal pools on each of these wildlife refuges, and it was many, many times the number of pools that we had found. These are small, isolated, seasonal wetlands, and they're expected to be particularly sensitive to all kinds of environmental drivers. So this is our just a summary, a synthesis of all our monitoring data. The top plot there in the orange is the population dynamics of wood frogs, and in the blue is the population dynamics for spotted salamander. This is across all of the parks and refuges that we've worked with since 2004. On the y-axis here, we're plotting occupancy. And so occupancy of 1 at the top there would mean that all the sites are occupied. And the occupancy of 0 means that none of the sites are occupied. And what we see that though there's some fluctuations in the occupancy across years, and certainly when you get down to the pond level, there's fluctuations in which ponds may be occupied. Overall, we see from 2004 to kind of the present day that occupancy of both species is about 50%. And that means that in any given year, about half of the vernal pools are expected to be occupied by either wood frogs or spotted salamanders or both. On the bottom left here, we plot out, now this is by latitude, and each of the different colored boxes are one of the parks or refuges that we work with. And on the right, that little gray box there, that shows again the average occupancy across the region. And on the left is for wood frogs, and the right is for spotted salamanders, and I put those pictures there just to index those plots. And what we found is that there was support for this latitudinal trend in the occupancy trends, meaning the more southerly parks and refuges tended to have declines. So their estimated trend there was below that dotted line, that's the 0 line of a stable population. And as you proceeded north, those populations were more likely to have stable or increasing trends. But you can see here in the box plots, there's lots of individual variability within each of the parks. And that variability represents the among year variability in the trend. Okay, so talking with these land managers, there's general concerns in the Northeast related to these kind of 3 major drivers. The first is a climate driver. This is principally what Aram and Ben were talking about related to hydroperiod of ponds, that ponds are just drying out earlier. They're not maintaining habitat for species very long. Disease is also a major concern. So in the Northeast, we have a number of diseases: rhinovirus, Parkinsis, and a newly emerging pathogen, the salamander fungus, are of concern. And then the position of the landscape and that terrestrial habitat and availability is also a concern. And so I'm not going to go into it here, but what we've learned from our research is that interactions among these 3 stressors are complex. It's hard to find unequivocal support for which combinations of these stressors tend to be worse because it varies among years. We find that contaminants or the influence of landscape position and land use could influence disease risk, and that the landscape history could also be influencing trends. So not only the stuff that you're doing to the landscape now, but what has been going on in that landscape and how degraded it was before it became forested may also be influencing dynamics. So we approach this with managers thinking about, well, what are the optimal management strategies that you might be able to employ on your parks and refuges, on your landscapes, to maintain amphibian populations. And we do this within what's called a structured decision-making workshop. And in 2018, I think, back when we all met in person without masks, we work with a number of refuges here, the Lake Umbagog up in New Hampshire, the Eastern Massachusetts National Wildlife Complex over in Eastern Massachusetts, and then down in West Virginia, the Canaan Valley and the Patuxent Research Refuge. And working with them, we realized that there's multiple objectives that they're thinking about, and they fall under these 2 themes. The first is one on biological diversity. So wood frog and spotted salamander populations they wanted to maintain. But there's other things about rare plants, about migratory birds, and about turtle populations that also had to be factored into the management decisions that they were making. There's this other set of objectives that were related to ecological integrity and ecological health. And so these are all parks and refuges. There's no commercial harvest going on here, but I could think about adding this other set of objectives of economic value or economic return also. And that's what makes these kinds of management decisions or solutions to these management problems complex, is there's lots of moving parts, there's lots of objectives, lots of things that you care about. So we worked with a group there to come up with this, we call it an influence diagram. These are just all the things, all the drivers of the populations that we think influences persistence of these species. A large set of things that are that can respond to management, and also management may be used to respond to drivers like climate change or landscape change, or other kind of factors that might increase persistence. We came up with these kind of 4 action themes. So maybe there's hydrologic stuff that you could do to maximize metamorphosis. Maybe you can manage some vegetation. This also helps to maintain the ecological integrity of these sites. Maybe there's some direct population management kinds of things that you can do for the wood frogs and spotted salamanders. And then there's this human disturbance part. And a lot of the parks and refuges that we work with tend to be in urbanized or urbanizing areas. And so considering how those external factors are affecting populations are really important. I think I'm just going to focus on the hydrologic management actions right now. Here we thought about there's kind of pool level actions. You can create more vernal pools. You can increase the hydro period by deepening pools. You can make more temporary pools by filling in permanent or semi-permanent pools if we think that that kind of habitat and the predation risk that's associated with those permanent pools is limiting populations. You might increase shade or modify hydrology, do other kinds of things to kind of increase the probability that a pond will persist for successful metamorphosis. Then there's other things that you might think about doing at the landscape level. So folks talked about removing pools to remove the presence of predators. That's not a well-supported kind of management action, but something that they wanted to consider. Restoring or managing hydrology, managing beavers that are creating this shifting mosaic of kinds of habitats in the landscape, maybe making encouraging beavers in some locations and discouraging them at other to maintain this landscape heterogeneity. And other kinds of things that you might do in urbanized landscapes. So we on the bottom left here, Adam Green was a graduate student with me, and we looked at the probability of quasi-extinction of these populations in two different landscapes, and also the time to extinction there on the other y-axis, as a function of the number of pools, so the density of habitats. And overall, what we found is between 20 and 50 pools, on the landscape are kind of a good number to shoot for maximizing or minimizing the probability of extinction and maximizing the time to extinction. And so this is, thinking about the density of habitats and, the number of locations that amphibians can breed in and disperse to and grow in is useful. We wanted to test the ability to change or create habitats to increase the hydro period, and that's shown in the pictures on the right here. So this pond in particular tended to go dry before amphibians could successfully metamorphose. And so we got a bunch of folks out there, we deepened it, we installed a liner, and then we surrounded it with this drift fence so we could track how the result of our management to modify that hydro period. So this occurred between 2008 and 2010 at the Patuxent Refuge. We modified hydro period of 3 pools. And then we did mark recapture at the ponds. And we looked at adults coming in and leaving these ponds during breeding, and then the production of metamorphs. So what we found is that the breeding and metamorphosis varied by year and hydro period, which we totally expected. These habitats and these populations are dynamic. When we managed those hydro periods, the installation of the liner did extend the hydro period, and it resulted in an increase in successful metamorphosis, which is what we were looking for. We didn't observe an effective spatial arrangement. So what I should have said is some of these pools that we managed were isolated. There was no other ponds within half a kilometer or so, and others were part of a cluster of ponds. They had 2 or 3 ponds nearby. We found that whether or not you had a pond nearby didn't influence the effectiveness of this management. They both had the same probability of producing metamorphs, so suggesting that each of those ponds functioned semi-independently. And so overall, we found that this management action increased breeding and metamorph occupancy probabilities. And so it's useful if you're thinking about managing particular spots in the landscape to create vernal pools or increase the hydro period of vernal pools, make them more productive. This is a useful management action. Okay, so there's other things that we might do at the directly for the population. I'm just going to focus on one here that comes up a lot, and this is the problem with having a pool that you're observing, populated eggs are deposited, larvae are developing, and then you have a drought like we're having here in Massachusetts, where the pool hydro period is short enough that you would end up with a whole bunch of dead metamorphs. And so the interest here is in increasing larval survival. And a common action that folks like to do is to move egg masses from one site to another. So this is work with Canaan Valley. We came up with what's called a decision tree, where we're deciding whether or not we're going to move eggs in a given year. Maybe the place that we know that the probability of successful metamorphosis is related to the density of number of conspecifics. So if you have a highly dense site, the probability and the size of metamorphosis of the individuals may suffer. So that might be a choice of where you move these. Maybe you decide not to move the eggs, but we still want to keep track of what would have happened if you didn't move the egg masses. And then there's a chance, this is a stochastic probability, that the pond persists in a year. You don't know going into it whether or not that pond's going to persist. It all depends on summer precipitation, the water table, all kinds of things that are going into maintaining the hydro period. But we have some guesses of whether or not a pond might persist based on previous years, looking at previous years' data. And so then what we can do is we can calculate the probability an egg will metamorphose here on the right. That's the thing we care about. That's what our management action in translocating these egg masses is designed to do. And then we can move that over to the left here, which is maximize the number of metamorphs. And this is what we call the expected value of making this decision to move eggs. So we're working with Canaan Valley. This is an annual decision. There's other factors that involve like precipitation, where we move those egg masses, other species, those kinds of things that are going into this kind of complicated, what seems like a really simple decision, should I move these eggs or not? But really when you're thinking about maintaining populations on the landscape, the meta population level, it gets more complex. I think I'm running out of time, so we're working with another refuge here. Again, this is that influence diagram that I talked about. And here's a combination of management actions that we're thinking about that include restoring hydro period, creating buffers when you're harvesting timber, adding woody debris, creating vernal pools, and then managing RD close, that's road closure, either in the early season when the adults are migrating to and from ponds or later on. These are in landscapes that are have lots of humans. Okay, so we're working with managers to use that kind of approach to investigate the best combination of decisions. The last thing I want to talk about is disease. So there's a new fungal pathogen that's of real concern to us in the Northeast. This is the salamander fungus, or B-sal. It's expected to cause near complete mortality of eastern red spotted newts, and other species of amphibians are likely to be susceptible to it too in the United States. It hasn't yet occurred. We haven't yet detected it in the United States. So we're working with the Patuxent Research Refuge here to identify management, proactive and reactive management actions to help minimize the number of infected sites, recognizing there's all kinds of other issues with the ability to know whether or not B-sal has colonized and it started to affect populations, and also recognizing that there's lots of treatment options that may be available, but there's nothing that's been tested, nothing that's been approved, nothing that shows that it will work for certain on these populations. So there's lots of uncertainty, but folks still have to make decisions about what to do. And so we're working with the Patuxent Research Refuge and other refuges in the Northeast on this decision. So this is the kind of outcome that we have. We can keep track of populations, the proportion of sites on the left. Each of the columns here on the left is whether or not the host is extinct, the red spotted newt, or whether the host persists. And each of the rows is whether or not the pathogen is present, either at high levels, that's a high prevalence of B-sal, at low levels, so few individuals are infected, or no B-sal, meaning the site disease-free. And ideally what we would like is to be in that bottom right box, right? The host is persists at a site, B-sal is not present. But we recognize that that might not be possible given the way animals move around the landscape. So we have developed a model. We're working on these simulations to include this scenario here includes a combination of actions that are taken after you start to see mortality of the newts there. Now on the right, we can keep track of the overall at the end of say 30 years. How many of our sites are extinct with the host? That's the left plot there, and how many does the host persist? And given this set of actions here, we think that, that red kind of dot up there on the right, it's around 60% of the sites. We think that this set of actions would result in the host persisting with no B cell. So this is a promising course of action. There's lots of uncertainty here, you see, and there's other trade-offs that need to be included in this analysis. And we're just at the beginning stages of coming up with these results. But B cell is definitely a concern in populations of amphibians in the Northeast. So even if you create and maintain habitat, you may still have disease risks that you'd consider managing for. Okay, so this is another example. Here we have two diseases in the yellow boxes, BD, which is the frog chytrid fungus, and amphibian ranavirus, both of which affect or may affect amphibian populations, particularly vernal pool populations. They're sensitive to stuff on the left, like temperature and salinity, so whether or not amphibians might be able to grow and die from these two pathogens depends on some combination of temperature and salinity. The pathogens may or may not interact. The kind of jury is still out on that. But ultimately, we're keeping our eye on that wood frog persistence, that box on the right there. And so we have this model, and we're working to estimate the probability of persistence given the combination of temperature and salinity on the influence of these pathogens. And then we thought about management actions that might change the temperature and get us in that target range of salinity that we're working with the refuge managers to think about how to employ to reduce the endemic disease risk. I have just a couple minutes here, so I want to make one more thought that I tend to have when thinking about, I've thought about in my evolution as a kind of research scientist over the last 15 or 18 years or so. And that's, I do a lot of monitoring. So that's conducting surveys to look at the proportion of sites that are occupied in any given year, the psi parameter. And what we tend to see with amphibians is a decline. So if I look at that, that's that total line, that white line on the bottom. So occupancy declines over time. It might be a result of, one or more factors. So here I just estimated the contribution of the decline of each of those different factors to that total decline. And so maybe factor one has a decline rate of 3% per year, maybe factor two is 4% per year, which still each of those alone results in kind of significant declines or substantial declines, and combined they result in this total decline. Sorting out which of those factors is important to the decline sometimes helps us figure out where management should be targeted, but also takes a long time to try and figure that out. And so maybe we don't have to wait to be certain about what's driving declines. If we set those targets, we want at least a level of occupancy above or at 50%. We can think about the management actions that we might deploy that would help to get us there while still conducting this research and monitoring to learn what exactly is driving these populations. But the point is, maybe we don't have to wait to realize a decline before we start to act. Okay, so again, I want to thank you for inviting me to talk about this work. I hope that you find it useful in thinking about your management, and I'm happy to talk more about any aspect of this and how it might help think about your landscape management. We see regionally vernal pool amphibians are in decline across the Northeast. We find that this decision framing or structured decision making, particularly thinking about the other objectives that are at play in making these really complex conservation management decisions, that helps guide what we need to know most. So where is the information that we need in order to make the best decision? What is the best decision, and how might we deploy it across the landscape? All of my work is responsive to Department of Interior partners and land managers, and I really work to address threats to populations and threats to achieving conservation visions with those individual managers. But at the same time, I'm looking for these rules of thumb for an ability to translate the work outside of what I do at an individual place or with an individual manager. And this last point, considering proactive options, considering managing ahead of realizing a decline is really, I think, key to conservation. And so again, feel free to send me a message if you want to talk more. I'm always happy to engage in amphibian conservation discussion. I just want to end thanking all the Parks and Refuge partners that have contributed and motivated this work over the years. And thanks again.
Thank you very much, Evan. That was an excellent presentation. Some really great research projects highlighted there that found some really interesting stuff about vernal pools, and some great management takeaways as well. There was one question in the chat, and I'll get to that, but I want to just prime everybody else. If there's questions that have come up while Evan was giving his presentation, you can either unmute yourself and share that question over audio, or you can put it in the chat. And so get ready to give Evan those questions. The question that was in the chat was from Dr. Aram Calhoun. It was earlier on in your presentation. You had just introduced some of the findings in terms of climate impacts to vernal pools. And she asks, I would think the impact of winter would depend on where in the Northeast. What did you base those findings on? Here, less snowpack and freeze-thaw cycles really knock back our wood frogs and cause midwinter emergence for salamanders.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That it's dependent on where you are. So that was the overall kind of average across all of those places in the Northeast. And again, declines are more severe. We find declines more severe in the South and more stable and increasing populations in the North. So that's the overall average of the effect of climate. I think that particular population, in particular place in the landscape, are also maybe more or less susceptible to those kinds of winter and summer conditions. And so, thinking about where populations might be susceptible and how to do management for that susceptibility is really complex, like you're saying. Does that answer your question, Rob?
Yes, thanks. I think it's important to be context dependent and not average across different biogeographical areas, because the takeaway can be misinterpreted. That's my feeling. I've watched these populations over 20 years, and warming climate in the South where the winters aren't so rugged and hibernation is not so energetic is likely to have less impact than here in Maine, where I'm seeing sheets of ice covering the forest floor, delaying and killing wood frogs that are hibernating and so forth. So just a plea for context dependent before you embark on management strategies. Think about where you are, because the issues do vary.
Yeah, the other thing I should mention is that that was an occupancy metric. It wasn't an abundance. And so, we're defining that as having breeding evidence of breeding at a site. And so 1 wood frog egg mass and 1,000 wood frog egg masses in that analysis are identical.
Right, that's a good point, Evan. People need to realize occupancy isn't the same as vital populations.
I had one question, Evan, that kind of came to the top of my mind. Was you had a lot of federal and state wildlife refuges in your studies, and I'd wondered, outside of that, in the context of landscape across the Northeast, is a lot of privately owned land. And from your research findings, what have you produced to try and get this message of different strategies, different management options out to managers on private lands? Is there publications that are a little bit more focused on that demographic?
Yeah, we work through the Partners in Amphibian Reptile Conservation, which come up with the habitat management guidelines and those kinds of things, but no other communication outside of that. Yeah.
Is there any other questions from the group before we move on to our next item on the agenda?
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. I appreciate it. It was a great presentation. And now I'll pass it along to Jennifer Cartwright to give a short presentation on some of the work that's more climate specific.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
We can, yep.
Gonna share my screen. All right, able to see that okay?
Yep, we're seeing it in the presenter mode, so perfect.
All right, good deal. All right, so yeah, so I'm Jen Cartwright from USGS. I'm the research coordinator at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And yeah, I just wanted to thank USET for this invitation to participate in this webinar. My part will be brief. So Evan has given us that overview of the USGS Northeast Army program and its efforts to research population dynamics for amphibian species in vernal pools. So I'm just going to take a quick next step here to review some of the potential climate change impacts. Some of those have already been alluded to several times, and then present a study in which we tried to identify pools that might be more resistant to certain climate impacts. So climate change impacts on vernal pools are expected to vary, as we've discussed some, but in general, we expect hotter and longer growing seasons, which imply stronger evapotranspiration and an earlier seasonal ramp up of ET. In some regions, droughts may intensify. We've seen some of those drought impacts earlier in the discussion. And all of this suggests the potential for earlier seasonal drying of some vernal pools. That's something that both Aram and Evan mentioned earlier, with potential cascading impacts on water quality, temperature, nutrient cycling, food webs, and just really many aspects of wetland structure and function. In terms of amphibian reproduction, there's potential that under climate change, many pools may start to dry out before some species are able to complete their life cycles. And there's the hope that some pools might be less affected by that problem and thus could provide refugia for amphibian reproduction. This gets to some of what Aram was discussing in the video about the importance of having a variety of pools with different hydro periods. So this study used a data set of field observations collected by Army from March through July from 2004 through 2016. Inundated depth was recorded at each visit along with inundated length and width, which allows us to calculate an approximate inundated area. All told, it was about 3,000 inundation observations from 450 pools that were located on 16 protected areas from West Virginia to Maine, generally the same protected areas that Evan mentioned earlier. So then we linked those inundation observations to a suite of predictors using machine learning models. We started with preliminary models that had 22 predictors and then simplified those down to a final set of 12 predictors, including seasonal timing, obviously, which was represented by the Julian day, short-term weather variability, and then longer-term climate, pool size and area to depth ratio, and then various topographic, soil, and land cover variables. We conducted leave one out cross-validation to test the model prediction accuracy. And then this allowed us to generate individual predictions for each one of the 450 pools with an associated range of confidence in those predictions that varied from one pool to another. So then we generated predictions of pool wetness probability under a variety of scenarios representing short-term variability in weather, as well as longer-term climate change. And we did this independently for each of the 450 pools in the study, such that an individual pool's unique characteristics were helping to drive the predictions, including pool size and shape, elevation, land cover, forest biomass, soil characteristics, et cetera. So this is an example for one particular pool showing predictions for how it could dry out over the course of the season from May through July. The orange curves represent dry weather and the black and blue curves represent average and wet conditions. The dashed curves use historical climate variables to drive the model, whereas the solid curves use 2080s climate under RCP 8.5. So you can see that for this particular pool, the drying process is pretty strongly dependent on the climate and weather conditions. Whereas this is a different pool that is projected to be dry, or at least have a pretty low probability of wetness throughout the season, unless the weather conditions are wet. And then this third pool, so another example here, looks to have pretty high probability of wetness throughout the season, even under dry weather conditions and even under climate change. So this supports that idea that there's a lot of variability among pools, as we know, and that some pools like this one might potentially function as hydrologic refugia. So we can then map the likelihood that a pool could function as a hydrologic refugium by holding water later into the season under future climate conditions. You can see here that the hollow triangles, there were some pools that had relatively low prediction confidence, so we didn't generate predictions for those. A few caveats on this approach. First, the inundation observations came from the field, but the topographic and soil and land cover attributes came from landscape scale GIS data sets. That's just what was available. So I certainly think that this kind of approach would be a lot much improved if those data came from field observations of the soil and land cover that were made directly in the field. Second, these pools were all on protected areas, as we mentioned, so we can't really say how some of this might or might not translate to pools that might be on private land. And then also there are, of course, many unmapped vernal pools. So we're really only using a small subset. 450 is a decent sample size, but it's still only a very small subset of the overall pools on the landscape, just the ones that had existing data. And then finally, Aram and others were mentioning the importance of connectivity and hydroperiod diversity. So that's just another important point as well. So this is the paper that we published in Ecohydrology in 2021. And Tony Lynn and Evan are on this call as well. So I think I will just stop there, and I'll stop sharing. And Tyler, I don't know if you want to go into a discussion now.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jennifer Cartwright. That was a great presentation. I want to open it up to any immediate questions for Dr. Cartwright, and then we'll move on to the last thing in our agenda as far as content goes, which is going to be a panel discussion. So there'll be the opportunity to ask any questions to Dr. Cartwright then as well. But any burning questions right off the bat that we'd like to ask her?
And I'll put the link to the paper in the chat just in case anyone wants to take a look at it. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll include that in the follow-up email about today's webinar. I had one question. You mentioned the caveat of mapping climate resilient pools, being that it could be better if we had more data observations of these pools, in-field observations of these pools. What about with the breakthroughs that we've gotten in GIS data and some of the more, I guess, fine data sets that are out there? Is there something that's on the cusp that you think might be useful for this particular type of research in the near future, or maybe that's something that's in the early developments?
Well, we were using the highest resolution data sets that were available. We were not using LiDAR, which, depending on the resolution, might be useful for some pools. My guess is that still you're going to do a lot better with field observations, because there's going to be a difference in what even a very high resolution map of, say, soil characteristics or water table depth. That's, and, you know, this is something that Aram or others might want to comment on as well, just that there are going to be indicators from the pool itself that you're probably never going to be able to get from a landscape scale or regional GIS data set. So just to acknowledge that, and that as much sort of ancillary data as we can be collecting on pools. In addition, obviously the hydrology and the amphibian monitoring are the keys that everyone is working on, but just getting those sort of other ancillary data sets as much as possible can really help refine any kind of modeling approaches.
Maybe just to add to that, I was thinking about, you know, there's a lot of emphasis in deploying technology to be able to collect more data in more places, and maybe a de-emphasis on thinking about these field observations. And I think, like Jen was saying, like Aram pointed out, that you can substitute technology for some kinds of data collection, but if you want to really tell this whole story, really those field observations are useful, at least to calibrate, you know, what the remote sensing, what the technology is telling you. So yeah.
Right, and just to say that Jen is right, we do have a number of ways to guess hydro period of pools from the soils and from the plants that folks can use at the local level, and that's on our website. There's a little PowerPoint that talks about how you might do that. And then I had a question for Evan and Jen, if I could, really quickly. Some of the earlier climate models were saying our summers were going to be wetter, and that doesn't seem to be happening. I always worry about us predicting which are going to be climate resilient when we're not really sure what's going to happen with our climate. There's a little uncertainty there. So if you guys could address that.
Yeah, my and I'll let Jen go too. My read of the kind of climate forecasts, particularly with respect to precipitation and kind of soil moisture, is that we have a hard time predicting that. We think that it's going to get warmer. I'm not really sure if it's going to get drier or not. And especially like thinking about amphibians and how complex their life cycles are, and the timing of the water is really important, both for metamorphosis and then also for that early survival of the juveniles before they head into winter. And our ability to make forecasts of that precipitation are really not great. Jen.
Yeah, like you're saying, Evan. So, you know, most climate models, there's a general consensus about warming, whereas precipitation is a lot trickier. So it also matters a lot what kind of time frame you're aggregating over. So something like annual precipitation is not probably all that helpful. And even seasonal precipitation, like summer precipitation, can mask that you can have different processes going on within that. So for example, I know in some areas, I don't know about where you are in Maine, but I know that in some areas there's some of the projections showing that even if you don't have a huge change in the total seasonal precip, that if you're getting larger precipitation events, so like heavier downpours that are separated by longer dry periods, that has hydrologic consequences, even if the overall total volume of precipitation doesn't change that much. So you're right, like precipitation is tricky, and sometimes you really have to decompose that into finer time steps. It is possible in some cases to have both increased like heavy precip events and also more droughts, sort of both extremes increasing with some of the future climate modeling. And you're right that the spread across models is much greater for precipitation than for temperature. Now, it's worth pointing out that the relative certainty around temperature is important for moisture because temperature is the main driver of ET. And so even if you had a moderate amount of wetter summer precipitation overall, that could still be outweighed by even stronger increases in ET from higher temperatures, such that the overall effect on the hydrology of pools could be that they dry out sooner, even if you're getting a little more precipitation in the future because of the ET effects.
Right.
And those effects, there's a lot of certainty around that in the future.
Right. And you hit it on the nail. Just in Maine, over the past 3 years, we've had different summer precip, and we dried up all our pools in June last year, and then we had a ton of rain in the fall. So what you're saying is it's very, and that's why I'm arguing for maintaining a diversity of hydro periods, because we're not exactly sure what's going to be happening around the pools. And I know Evan was talking about more urban landscapes where, you know, you don't have the luxury of connecting all those different wetland habitats. So there's lots of thinking that needs to be done because of that complexity as well.
Casey, I saw you had unmuted. Is there something you wanted to add in on that?
Yeah, I was given a lot of some thought to it, and thank you both for sharing. So, you know, it is tricky as we're looking into climate change, and you know, from just a real general observation, you know, mine. We're seeing, you know, with warming temperatures in the Northeast, and even, you know, seeing the data showing, you know, increased precipitation or a number of heavy precipitation events. It almost seems like we're seeing the Northeast experience like some, in the summer, subtropical characteristics. So I just want to be real clear about that, not like changing into subtropical, but like subtropical characteristics, such as you can get a lot of rain in a short period of time, but in the periods in between that rain, if your temperatures are up and you don't have as much cloudiness, you're as Jen, as you had pointed out, your evaporation rates could go up dramatically. And so I think that's kind of this climate change adjustment that, you know, we're looking into, where the Northeast is, compared to maybe the South and Southwest of North America, is kind of known for its steady rains when they happen, and the ecosystems have kind of evolved around that. But when we are now seeing things of like bang or bust in terms of rainfall, it's interesting to see these areas such as vernal pools like respond to that. This summer has been very unique on Cape Cod, where I'm at. I say unique because I'll have to crunch the numbers on how much precipitation, but I rainwater harvest. So my barrels have gotten full because of heavy rain events, but the grass is brown, and we are in drought. And so anyways, a little long-winded, but I just kind of want to acknowledge, you know, this change I'm seeing from my vantage point. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Yeah, I think that Aram made a good point that having a variety of hydro periods is going to be a way to be more resilient at the landscape level when it comes to these changes that we're still uncertain of, because we, you know, just even within the context of smaller ecoregions, there seems to be variability that you can't really put your finger on. It seems to be a little different. I know I've been visiting a lot of brown ash wetland forests in the southern part of the state of Maine, and they're very dry, and I don't need my boots. And I thought that I could leave my boots in the truck when I went to northern Maine, and up there, there is not a drought situation. And they've been getting periodic rain with some heavy rain events as well. And those sites are wet in there. So I'm sure the same persists with vernal pools across that range. So it's very interesting.
Guys, just share some thoughts about there's this emphasis on the kinds of landscape management. And so like Jen presented, this vernal pool refugia idea of identifying resilient ponds and doing, focusing efforts on them. And that with the caveat that you kind of have to have the information on the ponds before you can know whether or not it's refugia. And maybe other end is, what you're saying, let's protect the diversity of habitats, kind of spread that risk around because we're not sure what kind of year it's going to be. And I think like in both cases, right, if you're thinking about, well, I want to maintain populations of amphibians, both of those strategies are going to get you there. You're going to have populations in those ponds that you protected, that you've identified as resilient. And on average, you're going to have populations on a landscape where you have a diversity of hydroperids. Where they occur, how many there are they in the places that you desire? That all goes into that complexity of the decision, and also the trade-offs that you're making. If you're only focusing on those climate resilient pools, you might lose the other kinds of ecosystem services that the non-resilient pools might be providing. And if you focus on the diversity of habitats, hydroperids, or creating diversity of hydroperids, maybe you're ignoring some potential benefit to some species. So I think like as these rules of thumb, both rules of thumb will get you to some amphibian conservation, but recognizing that the trade-offs that come with them, the ability to achieve these other objectives, is where it gets really hard.
Yeah, Evan, I'm glad you said that. I was going to make that as a final point, that if we back out from focusing on period pools, have different functions in the landscape, and even the ones that are going to be on the drier end have other ecosystem services. And the fact is that wood frogs and fairy shrimp, of course, don't compete well in longer hydroperiod systems. So there's going to be a trade-off. It's not like all vernal pool amphibians need the same amount of time for breeding, and competition is a problem. And where we are, where there's detention basins and developments next to natural pools, we're seeing an increase in green and bull populations are able to carry chytrid over to wood frogs. So there becomes such a subsidized population of green and bullfrogs that they're spending more time at higher densities in vernal pools than we've seen in the past in some of our study areas. So, ecology is messy. So I think, Evan, you hit it right. We have to be thinking about all of the possible repercussions, but we don't want to do one thing. I guess that was the point.
Well said. I think you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. It's the same analogy, right? I pinned all of the speakers and those featured in the video here on the screen so that we can kind of move to the last element a little over on time. But if there are questions for the group, both featured in the video and those that presented, with regard to what was talked about today, please feel free to ask anyone on the panel or the whole panel a particular question, a burning question that you might have. And I have some here too as well to kind of round out our discussion if none come forward.
I had a question around something that you said in the video, Aram, around ecological traps and the problems with skitter ruts. And I just would like to hear more about that, and just anecdotally from any of you, how much of a problem you're seeing that to be. And then if that does happen, is it something that can be restored or fixed? Can you fill them back in, or is that just really difficult to accomplish? So the ecological trap problem sounds like it could really impact populations. And I'm just, curious to hear more about that.
I know some of the answer to that, but Mac, are you there? Mac Hunter did a study on this, and I'd like him to. Mac, my impression is that forest forest people are doing a much better job at skidder ruts in terms of putting slash down and so forth. But you're the one who did the study, and I'd like you to answer Jen's question about what you folks found.
Yeah, unfortunately, it was long enough ago that I can't recall all the details. It was published in Forest Sciences. Danielle DeMauro and I could dig up the reference or even the PDF and send it out. But it was just a 2-year study, and the very simple takeaway message was that in some years they were ecological traps, and in some years they weren't. A relatively wet year, they actually produced metamorphs, and the second dry year, the large numbers died. So, no real clear take home from that. I don't recall offhand that this detail would be in the paper. The sizes of the population involved. So with the death events, I'm not sure if they were tens of egg masses or hundreds. So I can't speak to that because I can't recall that detail. As to Ram's point about the commonness of skidder ruts, I think that's probably true that they're less problematic, but I still see them. So it definitely hasn't gone away as an issue.
Yeah, and I think you asked also for anecdotal impressions, and most of them aren't deep enough to maintain breeding, success of animals coming out. And the thing that I'm concerned about is that the frogs who are going back to their natal pools aren't making it to their natal pools. So, they're probably more susceptible to chemicals and other things that are going to be in those ruts. So, all in all, it's a good idea if they're, and yes, they can be remediated, they can be filled in. And my impression is really walking around in the woods, Mac, in the last 10 years, I see a lot less than we used to, but that's certainly something that the nations can think about when they do forest practices is leaving shallow ruts, or people are putting slash on them and driving over that, which has been good for major entry points. But I'm not a forest practices expert at all, but I hope that answers your question somewhat. I do remember that Danny's take home in her paper was that they were generally ecological traps.
In dry years.
Yep. Which we don't see anymore, dry years, right? Yeah.
Ben, feel free to chime in about your take on this on Penobscot tribal lands. I know that in my work on Passamaquoddy tribal forest lands, when we do harvest inspections, the depth of skidder ruts is one of our inspection points on all of our crews. And we will, in the case that we find skidder ruts are deeper than what we would like to see, or there's not a lot of slash being deposited in the skidder trail, have them go back and do some remediation, drop their blade and kind of plow that back over and then deposit slash over that. So, I think it provides us another angle to say why it's important. There's an ecological trap that could be seen here if we don't do this remediation. So that might be a good selling point on some loggers, or give us a better, purpose for doing it. So that was a takeaway for me when I went out with you guys. I appreciated that. But go ahead, Ben, if you wanted to share more on that.
I wish I had anything to add, but I do not.
No problem. I know that you're the wildlife resource manager, not the forest manager. We should have had Seneca up here and Ben too.
I tried to get those guys involved.
Yeah,
Everyone's so busy that it's
right.
hard to tie anyone down for an afternoon.
Yeah, no, certainly. Totally understand. So as we're kind of coming to an end here, I have a couple more panel questions. I'll ask one, and then don't hesitate to put another one in the chat from the group. I don't want to take any anyone's chance to ask a question, but the Penobscot Nation Wetlands Program and the Forestry Program communicate on protecting water resources. I'm wondering what is being done to support this type of communication. Do you have lessons to share with others on encouraging this interdepartmental communication?
I think you're under the impression that we have effective communication because I'm still new, and a lot of our forestry department is also brand new. And so we're learning, and our go-between is our new director, Chuck Loring. He was the forester for a long time, and then he was the forest manager, and now he is the director. And so I'm still in the mode where if I have forestry questions, I go to him, which then, because he can answer all of my questions, but I need to switch that and start reaching out to Ben and Ben Stevens and Seneca Stevens in order to get my questions answered. So we're still trying to figure things out as far as the department goes, just because it's all new and everyone is still new. But when we have to communicate, which we don't really communicate that often, when they have proposed logging operations, they'll reach out for me to provide a memo describing if there any effects they might have on wildlife, which is required. Other than that, from what I've seen since I've been here, the forestry department is taking all the things into consideration that I would want them to. And so they don't really need me for most of their day-to-day or what they're doing. They're doing such a good job with protecting vulnerable areas out there that I don't really have any concern or any changes that I would see for them to make. So we're kind of in a good spot as far that I can see.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I feel like it's nice to know that you've got some leeway and you can trust the forestry department with how you would see things carry forward. And I'm sure they feel the same way when it comes to sending you memos, that they know that you're going to provide good input onto how to carry forward with their projects. So sounds like it's a good working relationship.
Yeah, I think it is. I think we're all on the same page, which is nice. Makes things easier.
And then we talked a little bit about this earlier, but climate resistant habitats or climate refugia seem to be like a very popular topic, almost a buzzword in the climate realm. And I always wonder, as practitioners, how we can take this information and apply it to practice on the ground. And I guess this goes for anyone on the panel, if there's ideas and strategies, application of projects similar to Dr. Cartwright's work and how that can be applied. I'd love to hear some thoughts there on that topic.
I can jump in. This is Tony Lynn Morelli. I'm a research ecologist with USGS, and I was a collaborator with Jen and Evan on this project. I would say that you can think about refugia, climate change refugia, or resistant habitats as just another layer of information that you could use to prioritize where you're going to take action, because there's never enough staff time or funding or time in the year to act everywhere, whether that's, or even kind of community support sometimes for like doing certain things, right? Whether it's sort of like keeping people away from a certain place. Arm was talking about that a little bit. And so in the end, the ideas that we have that Jen presented about for vernal pools, or, we have other refugia maps for certain tree species or other wildlife. Their models, we're not sure. We test them and validate them against other independent data sets, but it's just one piece of information along with lots of other information that you can use to say, like, okay, let's do something here, because it seems like this is a bit more of a priority than over there. Not magic, just you never get to do everything you want to do, whether that's dealing with invasive species or making decisions about cuts or all kinds of things.
I think Aram and I were talking earlier a little, climate refugia, it's maybe a rule of thumb. It's a shortcut for really thinking hard about all the complexities in the decision. So is maintaining, maximizing kind of hydroperiod diversity. That's another shortcut. Both of them can get you to the same place. There's other shortcuts that you could take for management. It all depends. So like whether or not that shortcut is appropriate depends on a bunch of things, including, like Tony Lynn was saying, how good those models are, how good our expectation that diversity of hydroperiod leads to what we want, right? That might depend on the kind of landscape, the kind of changes that we're expecting, all kinds of things. Same thing with refugia. And so, take those things, I think, as shortcuts for conservation, but if you really care in particular about a landscape or a resource, then it deserves more kind of systematic thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that we like to think of vernal poolscapes and back out for resilience. Obviously, if you're in northern New England and you have the luxury of conserving more land around pools, the greatest climate resilience is going to be some intact forests in New England. So what would be helpful, I think, for land trusts and folks trying to garner the attention of funders is having an area identified by you folks as good areas for climate resilience, for wetland resources or other things, to help with justifying, well, why should we look at this big, this 2,000 acres or this 1,000 acres or this 500 acres, where we still have large contiguous tracts of forest land. And it might be, people keep using the word refugia, and I keep thinking, God, it might turn out that northern New England is the refugia for pool breeding amphibians in the long run. So just something to think about, that all that great modeling work and maps might help with proposals for conservation.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Aram. That's kind of where my head went initially, which is too bad that it's always about chasing the next grant, but sometimes it is an important variable. I think if we did have the ability to kind of narrow in, if we just say, we'd like to look at the Penobscot Nation territories for vernal pools, it's hard. But if we know that there's some climate resilient areas and we can focus in on a study area, it's going to make the grant reviewer say, okay, this is a bit more logical. This is the ability of this project to make it through and achieve its objectives are way more increased than when they were saying across the entire ownership. And I think that's an important takeaway, some of that work. And it increases your decision-making capacity too. So I appreciated that insight, Tony. It was great that you were on the call to share that. So real quick, before we close out the panel, if there's something the panelists want to share about this topic of vernal pools, climate resilient habitats, that you'd like to make sure that the people engaged in this webinar take away that maybe hasn't been touched on, I want to give you a chance to share it now. Whoever would like to go.
As far as my department goes, we have no money really to do anything with wetlands. And so I want to, I'm not sure if anyone has heard about the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. But I want to stress how important that is for tribes to be able to do this sort of work. And so any way you can reach out to folks to get support behind that bill, it'll give us the opportunity to actually do this work more frequently. I have been rejected twice for the EPA wetlands grant, so I haven't been able to do any of the work that I have set out to do. But if there was a pot of money as large as the Recovering America's Wildlife Act would provide for tribes, then we would be able to have a more substantial wetland program and possibly have a wetlands biologist on staff, which would be great for us. So anyone on here that can help get the word out to support that bill. I think the Senate is supposed to vote on that in September. So just trying to keep the momentum going as much as possible.
Don't forget the volunteer aspect too, and getting kids involved. That's a huge asset that is greatly untapped. When it comes to field projects like this, if you don't have the funding, the grants, if you can get enough volunteers involved and get that interest level up, not only will you get enough hands to help you do what you need to do, but you'll also get that interest level increased. And those people could also start talking to their congressmen, their senators, people that can get these things really moving forward and get those much needed funds to where they need to go for these projects. So just my thoughts.
Thank you, Ann. That's a great perspective. I appreciate everybody on the panel, everybody that's shared presentations and featured in the video, and Nolan for making that excellent video. I'll share everyone's slides if you are okay with sharing your presentations with me, Dr. Jennifer Cartwright and Evan. I can send those along in a follow-up email to everyone. I'm going to share a few slides here as we close out. As I had mentioned earlier, we have some writing reflections that pertain to today's webinar. I think a lot of people shared through the conversation and dialogue one thing that they learned from today's webinar, but as we conclude today, give that some more thought, and feel free to send me a written reflection today. You can send it to me to my email, teverett@usetinc.org. And then this is the particular writing prompt for today. In the film Site Visit, Vernal Pool Conservation and Working Forest, Dr. Ram Calhoun discussed how vernal pools can serve as hotspots of biodiversity. You have habitats or features in the landscapes that you work that serve a similar role. Again, I think having that little bit of perspective on different features that are on the landscapes that you work, that might prioritize where you maybe place some of the limited funding that we have to do some of this work. And as we finish up, I want to say, well, Ali, thank you. The next webinar in the USET Forest and Wetlands webinar series is Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, mobilizing stewardship efforts in wetland restoration. That'll be on September 6th, same time from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern, or 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Central. A little typo there. And again, if you do type up one of those reflections, feel free to send that to teverett@usetinc.org. I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you to all the presenters and those featured in the video and participating in the panel. I learned a lot today, and I'm sure everyone else did, so I really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, Ali.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Tyler, will go ahead and stay on until everyone hops off. All right. I'll go ahead and save the chat. I've been saving that as well for follow-up questions. So go ahead and do that. Okay, and save chat. Okay, cool. All right, webinar 3 down. So,
Yeah.
Yep.
You want to stop the recording?
Yep.